Kelly Ann Bates was just like any other teenager, a bright young woman with her whole life ahead of her. To her family and friends, she was lively, warm, and full of potential. At just 14, her infectious energy made her the kind of person you couldn't help but love. But in 1993, Kelly met someone who would change the course of her life forever. A man who was older. A man who seemed kind and charming at first. And over time, he became an ever-present part of her world. To those around her, everything appeared normal. But slowly, Kelly started to change, pulling away from the people who loved her, keeping secrets, and becoming more withdrawn. No one could have predicted the events that would unfold over the next few years. Events so unimaginable, so horrifying, that they would shake a family, a community, and an entire nation to its core. This is the story of Kelly Ann Bates, a story of trust betrayed, of unimaginable cruelty, and of a young life taken far too soon. Let's uncover the tragic case of Kelly Ann Bates and the lessons we must take from her story. While you are enjoying this interesting documentary, wouldn't you mind subscribing to the channel already? Please do. Kelly Ann Bates was born on May 18, 1978, in Hattersley, Greater Manchester. From the moment she could walk, her family knew she was something special. Kelly was the kind of person who could light up any room, a teenager with a kind heart, a sharp sense of humor, and a contagious laugh. She loved spending time with her friends, cherished her family, and had dreams of building a bright future. Her parents, Margaret and Tommy Bates, adored her. To them, Kelly was more than just their daughter, she was their pride and joy, their constant source of happiness. Like many teenagers, Kelly was independent and headstrong, always eager to explore the world on her own terms. But behind her youthful confidence was still the vulnerability of a young girl finding her way. It was in 1993, when Kelly was just 14 years old, that she crossed paths with James Patterson Smith. He was a man over 30 years her senior, but to Kelly, he presented himself as kind, attentive, and understanding. What she didn't know, what no one could have known, was that James Patterson Smith had a dark past. Smith was no stranger to relationships, but they all followed the same chilling pattern. Behind his mild-mannered exterior was a man with a history of controlling and abusive behavior. His former partners would later describe him as manipulative, violent, and relentless in his need for power. One ex-girlfriend, who narrowly escaped his grasp, spoke of how he isolated her from her loved ones and used violence to maintain control. But when James met Kelly, he didn't show that side of himself. To her, he was a gentleman, someone who showered her with attention and made her feel special. For a 14-year-old girl craving independence, Smith's charm seemed irresistible. Kelly's family initially had no reason to be concerned. After all, she was still their bubbly, bright daughter. But over time, subtle changes began to surface. Kelly stopped sharing as much with her parents. She started spending more time away from home, and when she was there, her cheerful demeanor seemed dimmed. What no one realized then was that James Patterson Smith wasn't just a man with a troubled past. He was a predator, carefully and deliberately isolating Kelly from the people who loved her most. And as Kelly grew closer to him, the cracks in the illusion began to show, marking the beginning of a dangerous and ultimately tragic journey. When Kelly met James Patterson Smith, she was just 14 years old. He was 45, a man who had lived decades longer, with experience, control, and cunning that Kelly couldn't possibly have recognized. The two met through mutual acquaintances, though Smith wasted no time ingratiating himself into Kelly's life. To her, he seemed mature and attentive, a stark contrast to the boys her age. At first, their connection appeared harmless, even flattering to Kelly. Smith played the part of a caring, protective figure, offering advice and listening intently to her dreams and insecurities. But beneath this facade, Smith was carefully weaving a web of manipulation. The age gap between them wasn't just significant, it was exploitative. Smith knew exactly how to gain Kelly's trust and slowly isolate her from the people who cared about her. Over time, Kelly began withdrawing from her family and friends. She stopped spending time with her closest companions, making excuses about being busy or tired. At home, she became more secretive, rarely sharing details about her life or her relationship. For Kelly's parents, the change was gradual but deeply unsettling. They couldn't understand why their once open and happy daughter had grown so distant. When Margaret Bates first learned of Smith's age, her instincts told her something was wrong. She tried to confront Kelly, but like many teenagers, Kelly pushed back. She insisted she was in love, that Smith understood her in ways no one else could. But Smith's control wasn't just emotional, it was psychological. He fed Kelly a constant narrative that her family didn't understand her, that her friends couldn't be trusted. He carefully dismantled the support system she had relied on her entire life, leaving himself as her sole source of comfort and guidance. The red flags were there, but Smith was skilled at hiding his true nature. At first, his controlling tendencies seemed like concern. He wanted to know where Kelly was, who she was with, and what she was doing at all times. He discouraged her from going out without him, framing it as an act of protection. But as the months turned into years, his behavior grew darker. Friends who once adored Kelly began noticing bruises she couldn't explain. They sensed her growing fear but didn't know how to help. Kelly, now entirely under Smith's influence, found herself trapped. She believed the lies he told her, that she was lucky to have him, that no one else would love her the way he did. By the time Kelly turned 16, the vibrant young girl her family once knew was gone. In her place was someone isolated, silenced, and entirely in Smith's control. What none of them knew then was how far Smith's obsession with control and violence would go. And as his grip tightened, the abuse Kelly endured escalated to a level of cruelty no one could have imagined. Over time, the cracks in Kelly and Bates' relationship with James Patterson Smith became impossible to ignore. What began as subtle manipulation and control escalated into relentless abuse, both physical and psychological. But by the time the signs became evident, Kelly was already trapped in a cycle of violence that she couldn't escape. Friends and family had started noticing troubling changes in Kelly. Margaret Bates, Kelly's mother, would later recall seeing bruises on her daughter's arms and face. When confronted, Kelly would dismiss the injuries with vague explanations, "I slipped," or "it's nothing." Her friends also noticed how withdrawn she had become, how the light in her once bright eyes seemed dimmed. Kelly, who used to laugh so easily, now seemed nervous and quiet, as if she was carrying the weight of a terrible secret. But behind closed doors, the truth was far worse than anyone imagined. Smith's violence was relentless and methodical. He didn't just hurt Kelly, he tortured her, physically, emotionally, and mentally. The abuse escalated over months and years. What started as slaps and punches soon became far more horrifying. Forensic evidence and testimonies from experts would later reveal the extent of Kelly's suffering. Smith would burn her with scalding water. He would starve her, depriving her of food for days at a time. There were signs that he forced her to remain awake for prolonged periods and even tied her up to prevent her from escaping. The injuries found on Kelly's body after her death were beyond comprehension. Her face, arms, and legs were covered in bruises, cuts, and burns. She had been stabbed multiple times, including in sensitive areas. But the most horrifying revelation came when investigators discovered that Kelly had been partially blinded. Smith had deliberately gouged out her eyes weeks before her death. The level of premeditation and cruelty was unlike anything the authorities had ever seen. Throughout this period, Kelly remained silent about the abuse. She had been manipulated into believing that no one would help her, that she deserved the punishment Smith inflicted. Her isolation was complete, cut off from her family, distanced from her friends, and under the total control of her abuser. Her parents, Margaret and Tommy, were desperate to bring their daughter back into their lives. They sensed something was wrong but struggled to get through to Kelly. Margaret once begged her daughter to leave Smith, but Kelly insisted everything was fine. Looking back, Margaret would later admit that she saw fear in her daughter's eyes, a fear she didn't fully understand until it was too late. For those who knew Kelly, the guilt of not being able to save her still lingers. Many friends said they felt helpless, unsure of how to intervene. One neighbor would later recall hearing arguments from Smith's house but never realizing the extent of the violence taking place inside. Kelly endured unimaginable suffering at the hands of a man she trusted. But Smith wasn't just a violent partner, he was a calculated predator, and his cruelty only grew as he sought to exert complete dominance over her life. April 16, 1996, marked the final chapter in Kelly and Bates' life, a tragic culmination of years of unimaginable suffering. She was just 17 years old when James Patterson Smith took her life in an act of violence so brutal, it shocked even seasoned investigators. In the days leading up to her death, the abuse Kelly endured reached its peak. She had been held captive in Smith's home, completely isolated from the outside world. He had stripped her of her autonomy, her dignity, and even her ability to see, having gouged out her eyes weeks earlier. Kelly was starved, battered, and broken, but she remained alive, subjected to Smith's unrelenting cruelty. On that fateful day, Smith claimed that Kelly had drowned in the bathtub. But when he finally called the police, his story quickly unraveled. Officers arriving at the scene were met with a horrifying sight. Kelly's lifeless body was found in the bathroom, covered in injuries that told a story far darker than Smith's fabricated explanation. The post-mortem examination revealed the full extent of Smith's brutality. Kelly had been stabbed over 150 times, with injuries scattered across her body, including her face, torso, and genitals. Her ribs were fractured, and her arms and legs bore clear signs of restraint. Smith had also inflicted severe burns on her body using a hot iron and scalding water. But the most chilling revelation was the duration of Kelly's suffering. The injuries weren't inflicted in one moment of rage, they had been administered over weeks, even months. Kelly had endured prolonged torture, with each act of violence designed to humiliate, degrade, and break her spirit. Smith's attempts to cover up the crime were both crude and calculated. He claimed Kelly's injuries were self-inflicted or the result of accidents, but the forensic evidence told a different story. The pattern of bruises, the precision of the stab wounds, and the signs of prolonged abuse left no doubt about Smith's guilt. Neighbors later reported hearing screams from the house in the weeks before Kelly's death, but Smith had always dismissed them as arguments or Kelly being difficult. He had also gone out of his way to isolate her, ensuring no one could intervene or witness the extent of his cruelty. When police questioned Smith, his demeanor was cold and unrepentant. He described Kelly as stubborn and blamed her for the arguments that led to her injuries. He showed no remorse, even as the evidence against him mounted. For investigators, it was clear, they weren't dealing with a man who had lost control in a moment of anger. Smith was a sadist, someone who derived pleasure from the pain and suffering of his victim. With Kelly's murder, the truth about James Patterson Smith's past finally came to light. And as the case unfolded, the full horror of what Kelly endured would send shockwaves across the nation. The investigation into Kelly and Bates' murder began immediately after James Patterson Smith called the police to report her death. From the outset, authorities were struck by inconsistencies in his story. Smith claimed Kelly had drowned accidentally in the bathtub, but the injuries on her body painted a far more horrifying picture, one of prolonged torture and calculated brutality. Detectives quickly focused their efforts on piecing together the events leading to Kelly's death. The post-mortem examination provided damning evidence. Kelly had sustained over 150 separate injuries, inflicted over a sustained period. These weren't injuries from a single violent outburst, they were the result of systematic abuse. The forensic pathologist described it as one of the worst cases of abuse they had ever seen, a sentiment echoed by seasoned investigators. As the investigation unfolded, details about Smith's past came to light, offering a chilling pattern of behavior. Former partners came forward, recounting stories of how Smith had abused and manipulated them. One ex-girlfriend described how he had held her under water to punish her, a disturbing similarity to Kelly's alleged cause of death. Another testified about his controlling and violent nature, painting a clear picture of a man with a history of preying on vulnerable women. Friends and family members of Kelly also provided crucial testimony. They spoke of how Kelly had changed after meeting Smith, becoming increasingly withdrawn and secretive. Her mother, Margaret Bates, recounted seeing bruises on Kelly and trying to convince her to leave Smith, only to be met with resistance. These accounts underscored the tragic reality of Kelly's isolation and the power Smith wielded over her. At the trial, prosecutors meticulously presented the evidence. The injuries Kelly sustained, the timeline of abuse, and the testimonies of witnesses all pointed to one conclusion: James Patterson Smith had not only murdered Kelly but had subjected her to unimaginable cruelty in the months leading up to her death. Smith, however, remained defiant. In court, he showed no remorse, blaming Kelly for the violence and attempting to paint himself as the victim. He claimed she had been difficult and insisted her injuries were self-inflicted or accidental. But the overwhelming evidence left no room for doubt. The jury took just 1 hour to convict Smith of murder. In November 1997, he was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a recommendation that he serve a minimum of 20 years. The judge, in his closing remarks, described Smith as a highly dangerous man and condemned his actions as sadistic and barbaric. For Kelly's family, the conviction brought a measure of justice, but it could never undo the pain of losing their beloved daughter. Margaret Bates would later describe how the trial was a grueling experience, forcing her to relive the horrors of Kelly's final days. She vowed to keep Kelly's memory alive and to raise awareness about the dangers of abusive relationships. Kelly and Bates' tragic death left a permanent scar on her family. For Margaret and Tommy Bates, the loss of their daughter was incomprehensible. They had watched as Kelly, once vibrant and full of life, was consumed by a violent relationship with a man who had destroyed her physically, emotionally, and mentally. The pain of knowing that they had been unable to protect her haunted them every day. Margaret Bates, in particular, would later speak openly about her grief and the regret she felt for not intervening sooner. Though she had suspected something was wrong and had tried to warn Kelly, she was still caught off guard by the true extent of the abuse. In interviews after the trial, Margaret urged other parents to be vigilant, to trust their instincts, and to recognize the early signs of controlling behavior in relationships. For Tommy, the loss was equally devastating. He recalled Kelly as a happy and hopeful young woman who had been looking forward to the future. The pain of losing her in such a horrific way was something he would never recover from. But through their grief, the Bates family found strength in honoring Kelly's memory and raising awareness about domestic violence. They became outspoken advocates, speaking out about the need for greater awareness and intervention to prevent others from falling victim to the same fate. The public and media reaction to Kelly's murder was one of shock and horror. News outlets across the UK and beyond reported the gruesome details of her death, shining a light on the darker side of relationships that, for many, had previously remained hidden. People were stunned by the brutality of the crime, but also by the way Smith had manipulated Kelly into complete submission. Her story became a cautionary tale for anyone in an abusive relationship, and for society at large. The case prompted a shift in public awareness about domestic violence and abuse. For years, the issue had been largely ignored or minimized, but Kelly's death sparked a broader conversation. Activists, support groups, and organizations focused on domestic abuse saw a surge in attention as people became more aware of the dangers posed by controlling and manipulative partners. It became clear that abuse didn't always come in the form of physical violence alone, it could also involve psychological manipulation, emotional coercion, and the gradual erosion of one's sense of self. In the years following Kelly's death, the UK government and various organisations took steps to address the issue of domestic violence more effectively. New initiatives were launched to help victims, and greater efforts were made to educate the public about warning signs and prevention. Support networks for victims were strengthened, and laws regarding domestic abuse became more comprehensive, with an increased focus on protecting vulnerable individuals from predatory relationships. But for the Bates family, these efforts did little to ease the pain of their loss. Despite the changes in society, the hollow absence of Kelly could never be filled. In the end, it was her story, one of innocence lost, of a life taken far too soon, that became the lasting legacy of this tragic case. The story of Kelly and Bates is a heart-wrenching reminder of the dangers that can lie within seemingly innocent relationships. For those who loved her, and for those who follow her story today, it is clear that recognizing the warning signs of abuse is crucial. Kelly's case illustrates just how easily someone can fall under the spell of a manipulative and controlling partner, often without realizing the full extent of the danger until it's too late. While not every controlling relationship will end in violence, it's important to understand that abuse doesn't always start with physical harm. Emotional manipulation, isolation, and psychological control are often the first steps in a gradual process that strips away a person's sense of self-worth and independence. Kelly's isolation from her family and friends, the bruises she covered up, and her increasing withdrawal from the world should have been red flags for anyone paying attention. But many victims of abuse struggle to see these signs themselves, let alone ask for help. Abusers are skilled at making their victims feel guilty, ashamed, and trapped, often convincing them that they are the ones at fault. This manipulation can be subtle, making it even harder to recognize when something is wrong. It's crucial to create an environment where people, especially young individuals like Kelly, can feel safe to speak out about their struggles. If you or someone you know is experiencing controlling or abusive behavior, there are resources available to help. In the UK, the National Domestic Violence Helpline provides confidential support to those in need, offering guidance on safety planning and connecting victims with legal and emotional support. In the US, the National Domestic Violence Hotline offers similar services, providing a 24/7 lifeline for those in crisis. There are also numerous local shelters and advocacy groups that can assist with both immediate needs and long-term recovery. These organizations are there to provide help, not judgment, and can connect those at risk with counselors, legal aid, and other services. If you suspect that someone you know is in an abusive relationship, don't ignore the signs. Approach the situation with care, but with compassion. Let them know you're there for them, that they are not alone, and that they deserve better. Sometimes, the first step toward breaking free from an abusive relationship is simply knowing that there's someone who cares enough to listen. For viewers who may be in a similar situation or know someone who is, remember, no one deserves to be controlled, manipulated, or abused. Help is available, and there is a way out. If you or someone you know needs assistance, reaching out for support could be the first step toward a safer, healthier life. Kelly and Bates' story is a tragic and deeply disturbing reminder of the horrors that can unfold behind closed doors. A young girl, full of promise and potential, was systematically broken by a man who preyed upon her vulnerability, isolating her from those who loved her and eventually taking her life in the most brutal way imaginable. But while Kelly's death is a heart-wrenching loss, her story is also one of critical importance. It serves as a wake-up call to recognize the early signs of abuse and to take action before it's too late. The more we understand the warning signs, manipulation, isolation, control, the better equipped we are to protect ourselves and those around us from falling into similar traps. As we conclude this story, we urge you to spread awareness about the dangers of domestic violence. Share this video with others, leave a comment, and subscribe to stay informed. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, don't hesitate to reach out for help. Resources are available, and no one should have to endure this pain alone. Kelly and Bates' story is a tragic reminder, but it's also a call to protect those at risk and ensure this never happens again. Together, we can make a difference.